So today we're going to be talking about 8.2a, 8.3a, which is factoring polynomial expressions. Now, before we get started on notes, I'm going to remind you that once you finish your notes and once you finish taking your notes, you're going to be working on the homework, and the homework is in the homework is in HRW. Now, when you're working, you should have plenty of time to get your homework done before you leave today. Then you don't have to worry about anything over the 3-day weekend. So make sure you are taking your time, using your time wisely by working on homework in class when you are given that time instead of goofing off. So we're going to set up our notes. And so today is all about, like I said, factoring polynomial expressions. So the directions are going to say factor completely. And the big word we're going to pay attention to that is completely, which means whatever our answer is, it should be completely factored. There should be nothing about it that can be factored anymore. So when you're factoring, the very first thing you always look for is you look for a GCF, or greatest common factor. The second thing we're going to look for today, because we're only going to be dealing with trinomials or a binomial, is we're going to do the T-chart method. And that is if it's a binomial or trinomial. If it's 4 terms, we're going to group it. So we're going to start off with our very first problem. I'm going to write it over here, and that is x squared plus 9x plus 14. And I'm going to rewrite that over here. Now, for the T-chart method, which is what most of you learned in terms of factoring in Math 1, we're going to draw our T. So on the top of the left part of the T is going to be where we put x squared. The right part will be 14. The bottom is 9x. So once we've done this, we say, okay, what multiplies to make x squared? And that would be x and x. Then we look at what multiplies to make 14. And there's different factors that can make 14. So let's start with 7 and 2. Does that make positive 14? Yes, it does. If both of these were negative, would that also make positive 14? Yes, it would. Now where this 9x comes in is by us doing this. And we go 2x plus 7x. Does that equal 9x? Yes, it does. So since that does equal 9x, we write our factors as x plus 7 times x plus 2. Now, how could I check to make sure I did this right? This is the only one that we're going to do this way, but if we needed to check, we could FOIL, back out, and we would get x squared plus 2x plus 7x plus 14. Then, if I combine like terms, I end up getting x squared plus 9x plus 14. Is that what we originally had? Yes, it is, which means our factored form is right there. So when it says factor completely, that's factored completely. So let's go to the next one. The next one is x squared plus 8x plus 15. Sorry, I'm going to move this up a little bit. So for this one right here, I'm just going to start right in with my t. So up here is my x squared. Here is my 15. Here's my 8x. So what multiplies and makes x squared? X times x. What multiplies and makes 15? 5 and 3. And if I go like this, I get 3x plus 5x. Does that equal 8? Yes, it does. Which means my factored form is x plus 5 times x plus 3. Now, am I going to go ahead and FOIL that out? No, because it's not asking me to. I was just showing you how you could check that way. Our final answer would be that right there. And we go to the next one. X squared minus 3x minus 10. I'm going to do my little t-chart. This is x squared. This is negative 10. This is negative 3x. What multiplies and makes x squared? X times x. Multiplies and make negative 10. We're going to say 5 and 2. Now, one of those has to be negative to get negative 10. So let's figure out which one has to be negative. Let's do this right here. And we get 2x and we get 5x. What combination of those is going to give me a negative 3? Is if this is a negative, which means that up there has to be a negative. That will give me negative 3, which means my factored form is x minus 5 times x plus 2, because negative 5 times 2 makes negative 10. Let's go to the next one. They're going to get a little bit harder as we go along, so we're starting with the easier ones, and then they will get a little bit harder. So the next one is 2x squared plus 4x minus 6. So now, before I do my t-chart for this, the very first thing I'm going to look for, which we didn't need to do just yet because there wasn't one, is we're going to look, is there a GCF? Is there something that goes into all of those? And yes, there is. There's a number 2 can divide into all of those. So I'm going to factor out that 2. So 2x squared divided by 2 is left with x squared. 4x divided by 2 is 2x. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. And I just factored out my GCF. Once I have that factored out, now I'm going to do my t. So I have x squared, negative 3, positive 2x. What makes x squared? X and x. What makes negative 3? 3 and 1, and one of them has to be a negative. So let's see if we can figure out which one. Do my little crossing here, and I get 1x, and I get 3x. Now, I want it to be a positive 2x, which means 1 has to be negative, 3 has to be positive. So 1's negative, 3 is positive. That will give us an answer of 2x. So factored form, x plus 3, x minus 1, and our GCF out front. Cannot leave that off because that's part of the equation. If I got rid of that, then I would not get this answer, and my whole goal is to get that answer. So now we're going to continue on, and like I said, they are going to get a little bit harder as we go along. So we're on number 5 right now, and that is going to be 6x squared plus x minus 15. So I look at that and say, is there a GCF that goes into there? There's nothing that goes into all of those. And it's a trinomial, so I'm going to do my t. 6x squared goes up here, negative 15 goes here, 1x goes there. So what makes 6x squared? Well, could be 3x and 2x, could be 6x and 1x. Let's start off with trying 3x and 2x. Then, what makes 15? 1 and 15, 5 and 3, there's a couple different things for that. So let's try 5 and 3. Now remember, the goal is to get negative 15, so one of those has to be negative. So let's see if this will work. So I get 9x and I get 10x. What possibility of those is going to give me a positive 1? If this is positive and 9 is negative, which means 3x times negative 3 would give me that negative 9x. Will this multiply and make negative 15? Yes, it will. So my factored form is just 3x plus 5 times 2x minus 3. And it's completely factored. And then the next one, 3x to the third minus 3x squared minus 18x. Now, first thing we look at is always going to be GCF. What goes into all of those? So the number that you might say goes into all of those is 3. Besides a 3, is there anything else that goes into there? All of them have an x. So I'm going to divide out a 3 and an x. So 3x to the third divided by 3x gives me x squared. Negative 3x squared divided by 3x gives me negative x. Negative 18x divided by 3x gives me negative 6. So I've just factored out my GCF. Now I'm left with a trinomial. So now I'm going to do my t. And I have x squared here, negative 6 here, negative 1x there. So what makes x squared? X and x. What makes 6? 3 and 2. One of them has to be a negative. So we're going to go and do our crossing over. We get 2x and 3x. How am I going to get a negative 1 with that? If the 2 is positive and the 3 is negative. So that means that's a negative. Will I get a negative 6 when I multiply it? Yes, I will. So my final answer is leave my GCF out front, and then x minus 3 times x plus 2. And there we go. On to the next one. We're going to be doing a lot of problems because I want to make sure we do all the different types. So the next one is 10x squared plus 20x minus 2x minus 4. So now, notice with this, the very first thing we look at, same thing. Is there a GCF that I could factor out of all of them? They're all divisible by 2. So I'm going to pull a 2 out, which I'm going to divide them all by 2. And I'm left with 5x squared plus 10x minus x minus 2. Now, the difference between this and what we were doing before is that is not a trinomial. Okay? It could be a trinomial if I combine like terms, but let's look at it as grouping. So this is what I was talking about when we're dealing with grouping. So I'm going to look at these two terms right here and these two terms right here. I'm going to look at them separately. So with these two, I say, okay, what do they both have that I can factor out? So they're both divisible by 2. So I bring this down. So they're both divisible by 5x, sorry. And I pull that 5x out. If I do, I'm left with an x plus a 2. Then I look at these two and I say, what do those both have? They both have a negative 1. If I factor that out, I'm left with an x, a plus, and a 2. Then it becomes a problem like what we were doing before with the zero product property. What do they both have? They both have an x plus 2. So this still keeps being brought down, and then I say, okay, they both have an x plus 2, so I'm going to divide it out, which means what am I left with? A 5x and a minus 1. Can that be factored any further? No. This is a binomial. Is there anything that can be factored out of that? No. Nothing can be factored out of that. So that is my final answer. So on to the next problem. Number 8. 14x squared minus 2x plus 21x minus 3. So I'm going to just go ahead and write this over here. 2x plus 21x minus 3. I'm going to write it twice because I'm going to show you how there's two different ways to do this one. And it is going to be up to you which way you do it. So on the left, I look at it and I say, is there a GCF that I can pull out of it all? No, there's not. So since there's not, I'm going to factor by grouping. So I'm going to group this group together and this group together. With the left group, what do they have in common that I could factor out? They're both divisible by 2 and x. If I pull that out, I'm left with a 7x minus 1. Then I look at the next one. What do those both have that I can factor out? They're both divisible by 3. If I factor that out or divide that out, I'm left with a 7x minus 1. Then I look at this and I say, okay, what do they both have? They both have a 7x minus 1. So I'm going to factor it out or divide it out, which leaves me left over with a 2x and a plus 3. That is the completely factored form. And that works because they already had it set up for you in terms of grouping. Now, doing it the other way, a lot of you looked at this up here and are like, well, why don't you just combine like terms? So let's combine like terms. And we get 14x squared plus 19x minus 3. Is there anything I can pull out of all of them? No, there's not. So then I'm going to do my t, and I get 14x squared, negative 3, 19x. Now, the reason why they did it this way is because there's a lot of factors of 14. There's 1 in 14, or there's not a ton, but there is some. There's 1 in 14, and there's 2 in 7. So if we were to try, let's try 2x and 7x. And then what makes 3? There's different possibilities. I could put 1 and 3. I could put 3 and 1. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and put 3 and 1. One of them has to be a negative in order for you to get that negative 3. So let's see which one that has to be. So if I go like this, I get 2x and I get 21x. What possibility of those is going to give me positive 19? If that's a negative and that's a positive, which means 2x times 1 has to be a negative. So then if I write this out, I get 2x plus 3 times 7x minus 1. Is that the exact same thing I had over here? Sure is. It's just in a different order, but it's still the exact same thing, which is totally fine to have. Doesn't matter which way you did it, you'd still get the same answer. So number 9. 4x squared minus 1. So I look at that, and that's a binomial. And there is no GCF. There's nothing that I could factor out of that. So then I'm going to go ahead and do my t. 4x squared goes up here. Negative 1 goes here. How many x's do I have? I have 0 of them. So I'm going to go ahead and put that there. So what makes 4x squared? 2x and 2x. What makes negative 1? 1 and 1, and one of them has to be a negative. So let's see how we can do that. And we get 2x and 2x. Remember, I want 0. How do I get 0? By making one of them a negative. So in factored form, this would be 2x minus 1 times 2x plus 1. And that would be the factored form of that. So now we're going to go on to number 10. Go ahead and set up my paper. And we get 16x squared minus 1. So this is very similar to the last one. It's a binomial. There's no GCF. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my t. And I get 16x squared up here, negative 1 here, and 0x there. So we look at it and we say, okay, what multiplies and makes 16x squared? I could do 8 and 2, I could do 16 and 1, or I could do 4 and 4. So I'm going to do 4x and 4x. I want to get a negative 1, which means one of those is going to have to be a negative. Does it matter which one? Well, let's see. Go like that, and we get 4x and 4x. How do I get a 0? Is if one of them's a negative. Does it matter which one? Nope. So I'll put it up top. So it ends up being 4x minus 1 times 4x plus 1. Will that equal negative 1? Yes, it will. Okay, so now something that you might have noticed with this. This is a perfect square of 4x times 4x. This is a perfect square of 1 times 1. This is called when you have a difference of squares. So when this is a perfect square, this is a perfect square, and this is a minus, then it's just the perfect square, perfect square, perfect square, perfect square. One's a plus, one's a minus, and then your middle terms will always cancel out and equal to 0. So knowing that, let's try one where we don't actually do the t-chart. So let's say that we had 9x squared minus 16. Perfect square root of 3x, perfect square of 4, and that's a minus, so it's a difference of squares. So knowing that, we said perfect square of 3x, perfect square of 4, and since it's minus, one of them's a minus, one's a plus. So if you think about that, there's my negative 12, there's my positive 12, which means they'll cancel out. That's where I get 9x squared. That's where I get the negative 16. So when it's a difference of squares like that, you can just jump straight into that knowing that it's a perfect square. So let's go to our next problem. 10x squared plus 19x minus 56. So there's no GCF that I can pull out of that. So I'm going to go ahead and do my t-chart, and I get 10x squared minus 56, 19x. There's lots of possibilities for these, so we can try a lot of different things. And it might not work the first time, so let's try our first time. So what makes 10x squared? Let's try 5x and 2x. Now, what makes 56? There's a lot of things that make 56. 7 and 8, 2 and 28. We can do lots of things. So let's try 7 and 8. One of them is going to have to be a negative in order to get negative 56. So let's see if this works. Go like that, and I get 40x, 14x. Is there any possibilities of those two going to get me 19? No possibilities. It doesn't matter which one's negative, which one's positive. I still won't get 19. So that doesn't work. So I'm going to try it again. 10x squared, negative 56, doing my t, 19x. I'm going to go ahead and put 5x and 2x here again. Let's try to switch the order. Let's try 8 up here and 7 down there. Remember, one of them is going to have to be a negative. So then I cross through, and I get 35x, and I get 16x. With those two numbers, can I get 19? Sure, if that's subtraction. So the negative 16, or the 16 has to be negative, which that's where I'm getting the 16, so that has to be negative. Will that get me negative 56 when I multiply it? Yes, it will. So factored is 5x minus 8 times 2x plus 7. Could I FOIL it all out and see if I get that answer? Definitely. Do you need to? Do you have to? No, but if you want to check your work, that's a way to check your work. So let's go ahead and go to the next one. We have 2 more problems left, and then we'll be done. 21x to the 4th minus x to the 3rd minus 2x squared. So what's the very first thing we look at? Do they have a GCF? So looking at all these, what goes into all of them? An x squared. So I'm going to divide it out. If I do that, I'm left with 21x squared minus x minus 2. Then I'm going to do my t for my trinomial, and I get 21x squared minus 2, negative 1x. So what makes 21x squared? 7x and 3x. What makes 2? And it's got to be a negative 2, so one of them is going to have to be a negative. Let's try 2 and 1 and see which one's going to have to be a negative. And I go like that, and I get 7x, 6x. Any possibility of those two numbers giving me a negative 1? Sure, if the 7's negative and the 6 is positive. This is where I get my negative 7, so there's where my negative is going to be. So my final answer, I've got to put my GCF out front, and then I get 7x plus 2, 3x minus 1. And that's completely factored. That's what it means by factor completely. There can't be any factors that you can still deal with. And then last problem, 4x to the 4th minus 14x to the 3rd minus 8x squared. So first thing I look at, what's my GCF that I can factor out all of those? Well, I see that they all have an x squared, but I also see they have a 2. So I'm going to factor out a 2 and an x squared. If I do that, 4x to the 4th divided by that leaves me with 2x squared. Negative 14x to the 3rd divided by that leaves me with negative 7x. Negative 8x squared divided by that leaves me with negative 4. Now I have my trinomial. I got 2x squared up here, negative 4 there, negative 7x there. What makes 2x squared? 2x and x. What makes negative 4? Could be 1 and 4, could be 4 and 1. So we can do 1 and 4, 4 and 1, 2 and 2. So why don't we'll try 4 and 1, see if that works. And we know one of them's got to be a negative because I want to get a negative 4. And I go like this, and I get 2x and 4x. Any possibility those two are going to give me a negative 7? Nope. So that doesn't work. So let's do it again. Sometimes it's trial and error. You're trying to get it to work. So we know the only possibilities to get 2x squared is 2x and x. So let's change it up. Let's try 1 up here and 4 down there. Remember, one of them is going to have to be a negative. I do my little cross, and I get 8x, and I get 1x. Any possibilities that's going to get me negative 7? Sure. If 8 is a negative, 1 is a positive. Where does that 8 come from? It comes from right here, which means my negative is going to go there. So my final answer is my GCF out front, and then 2x plus 1 times x minus 4. Now, you're going to have time to work on your homework now. Make sure you're using your time wisely because you should be able to finish your homework before you leave today. Okay? Have a good weekend and hope you have a good 3-day weekend. See you Tuesday.